Imagine you receive a letter. It's been sitting in a drawer for 2,000 years. The handwriting is urgent. The words feel alive, almost warm to the touch. But by the time the letter reached you, it passed through 100 different hands. Each one read it, made notes in the margins, crossed out lines they didn't like, added their own interpretation. Some of them meant well, some of them didn't. What you're holding now doesn't look much like the original. That's roughly what happened to the teachings of Jesus. Not because of some grand conspiracy, not because anyone sat in a dark room and decided to corrupt the message, but because meaning is fragile. It erodes over time. It gets shaped by power, by fear, by the very human tendency to make ancient, difficult ideas fit the life we already want to live. And here's the thing that stopped me cold when I first started looking into this. The original teachings, the ones underneath all that noise, are so much stranger, so much more demanding, and so much more beautiful than the versions most of us inherited. So today, let's open the letter. Let's try to read what it actually says. Picture the scene. A dusty hillside in first-century Judea. The air smells like heat and dry grass. A crowd has gathered, not the polished, put-together crowd you might imagine from a painting. These are fishermen with calloused hands, tax collectors who hate themselves, mothers carrying sick children, farmers who've lost their land to debt, people who are exhausted, scared, and deeply, privately desperate. And standing in front of them is a man speaking in Aramaic, saying things that no one in power wants to hear. That's the context. That's the room. By the time his words reached us, filtered through Greek translations, Latin manuscripts, medieval councils, Renaissance painters, colonial missionaries, televangelist stadiums, and social media memes, something fundamental shifted. The teachings that once made powerful people furious became the property of the powerful. The ideas that once set people free became chains of a different kind. This video isn't about religion versus skepticism. It isn't about pushing a theological position. It's about something more honest than that. Going back to the original text, sitting with the original context and asking, and with genuine curiosity and an open mind, what did this person actually mean? Because some of the most quoted lines in human history turn out to mean something almost completely different from what most people assume. And that difference isn't a footnote, it's everything. Let's begin with the phrase he used more than any other, the kingdom of heaven. It appears over 100 times across the Gospels. It's the heartbeat of everything Jesus taught, and for most people the meaning feels obvious. Heaven is a place you go when you die. Behave well, believe the right things, and one day you'll arrive there. Clouds, light, peace, the end. But sit with that interpretation for a moment. Really sit with it. If the kingdom of heaven is simply a destination after death, something you wait for, something you earn, then why was Jesus so insistent that it was urgently, immediately relevant to the exhausted people standing in front of him right now? Why would a dying man, being executed by the state, spend his final hours talking about a distant place nobody could reach until they were already gone? Something doesn't fit. Here's what scholars who've spent their lives with the original Greek text keep finding. Jesus almost certainly wasn't describing a place at all. When he said kingdom, his audience didn't hear a metaphor. They heard a political word. They lived inside the kingdom of Caesar, a system of power, taxation, violence, and humiliation. When Jesus said the kingdom of God, they heard it as a direct contrast, not a destination, a different way of organizing life, a present reality, an alternative that existed right now in the choices people made, in how they treated each other, in the invisible fabric of a community. When they pressed him directly, "When does this kingdom come?" his answer was almost startling. The kingdom of God does not come with signs to be observed. You cannot say, "Look, here it is," for the kingdom of God is within you, or depending on how you translate the Greek word entos, among you, right here, between these people, in this moment. He described it in parables that make no sense if you're picturing a place. A mustard seed so small you could lose it in the palm of your hand, growing into something that fills the sky. Yeast hidden inside dough, invisible, working quietly, transforming everything it touches. a treasure buried in a field that a man stumbles over by accident and then sells everything, to obtain. These aren't pictures of a destination, they're pictures of a process, an unfolding, something that can be found in the middle of an ordinary life, in an ordinary field, if you're paying the right kind of attention. This matters more than it might seem, because if the kingdom is a future reward, then Jesus' teachings become a transaction. Do these things, receive that prize. But if the kingdom is a present quality of life, a way of seeing, a way of being in the world, then his teachings become an invitation to live differently right now with the people around you in the only moment you actually have. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive into ideas is the kind of content you want more of, hit subscribe right now. Now we come to the teaching that has probably caused more eye rolls, more arguments, and more sincere confusion than almost anything else Jesus said. Love your enemies. People hear that, and they feel one of two things. Either a vague moral admiration, yes, very noble, very idealistic, completely impractical, or a quiet internal recoil. Because if you've ever been truly wronged by someone, you know that being told to love them doesn't feel like wisdom. It feels like being asked to betray yourself. That's agape. It's closer to discipline than to affection, and now, add the room again. These aren't abstract enemies Jesus is talking about. His listeners were living under a military occupation, real soldiers, real cruelty, real families destroyed by Roman taxation. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," everyone in that crowd had a face in their mind, someone specific, someone who had done something real. He wasn't offering comfort, he was offering something much harder and much more useful, a way out. Because what happens when you hate someone who's hurt you? You keep hurting, the wound stays open, you rehearse it at night, you pass it to your children. And if you act on that hate, if you retaliate, they retaliate back, and now the wound is in two families instead of one, and it spreads from there. Jesus was describing with devastating clarity exactly how cycles of violence perpetuate themselves, and exactly where the cycle can be broken. Not by the person who threw the first punch, by the person who refuses to throw the second one. That's not weakness, that's the most difficult and most powerful act a human being can perform. Turn the other cheek has been used to tell abused people to keep enduring, enslaved people to stay quiet, the oppressed to accept their suffering as holy. It has been weaponized repeatedly to keep the powerful safe and the powerless silent. That use is a betrayal of what Jesus actually said. Here's the detail that changes everything. Jesus was specific. He said, if someone strikes you on the right cheek. In the first century, the left hand was ritually unclean and never used in public. So a strike on the right cheek could only be delivered one way, a backhanded blow. And a backhand wasn't combat. It was the strike of a master to a servant, an act of deliberate humiliation that said, "You are beneath me." Now watch what happens when you turn the other cheek. The aggressor cannot backhand the left cheek. The geometry doesn't work. To strike again, they must use an open slap or a closed fist, the way you hit an equal. By turning the cheek, the person being struck forces a choice onto their aggressor. Either acknowledge my humanity or reveal yourself as someone who knows no other way to exist. In front of everyone watching. This is not submission. It is nonviolent defiance. Jesus wasn't teaching people to be doormats. He was teaching people with no conventional power how to exercise a different, deeper kind, the power of dignity that cannot be taken from you. Judge not, lest ye be judged. The most weaponized sentence in the English language, used in arguments, comment sections, family dinners, the universal conversation ender. Almost always used wrong. The irony, people who deploy judge not as a shield are usually doing it while judging someone else, judging them for judging. The phrase has become a mirror nobody looks into. The Greek word translated as judge is krino. It doesn't mean have an opinion or notice something harmful. It means to render a final verdict, to condemn, to declare with certainty that this person is beyond recovery, beyond grace, beyond hope. Jesus illustrated it with an image so absurd it must have gotten a laugh. Why do you look for the speck of dust in your brother's eye while a plank of wood sticks out of your own? Someone leaning in for delicate eye surgery, squinting, certain, with a 2x4 jutting from their face. The crowd laughed. The image burned itself into memory. The log is the self-deception we carry without knowing, the certainties about ourselves that make us very sure about everyone else. Harsh judgment of others almost always goes hand in hand with blindness toward oneself. What Jesus was warning against is the seductive pleasure of deciding you already know everything about a person, their motives, their worth, their story, and delivering a final verdict from that certainty, because you don't, you never do. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Most people nod past it. It gets translated in their minds as, blessed are the humble, and filed away. But the word Jesus used is Ptochos, not humble, not mildly lacking, destitute, the person who has nothing left, the beggar who cannot meet the eye of the person they're asking for help. Blessed are the spiritually bankrupt. Why? Go back to the crowd on that hillside. Many were already broken, and the religious culture around them had a confident explanation: God was punishing them. Their poverty was evidence of sin. Their suffering was proof of spiritual inferiority. Jesus looked at that crowd and said the opposite. The people who have been emptied, no status to protect, no spiritual accomplishment to hide behind, are actually closest to what the kingdom really is, because the kingdom isn't something you earn or achieve, it's something you receive, and you can only receive something when your hands are open. The person cracked open by grief, by failure, by suffering that stripped away every pretense, that person stands in a particular kind of openness, uncomfortable, raw, but real. And something real can enter through a real opening. The Beatitudes aren't a promise that misery is secretly happiness. They're a map of the unexpected places where depth can be found. The truth will set you free. It's carved into the CIA headquarters lobby, quoted by politicians, philosophers, self-help gurus, almost always meaning, be honest, transparency matters, not wrong, but a shadow of the original. The full sentence goes, if you hold to my teaching, you are truly my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. When he said it, the crowd pushed back immediately. We've never been slaves to anyone. Remarkable, because they were living under Roman military occupation. They understood the freedom Jesus was describing wasn't political, it was interior. He clarified, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. The Greek word Hamartia, translated as sin, is an archery term. It doesn't mean moral transgression. It means missing the mark. A life organized around things that cannot give it meaning, no matter how hard you pursue them. Anyone who has struggled with a compulsion will recognize this, the pattern that runs you when you're not paying attention, the resentment you return to like a bruise you can't stop pressing, the approval you chase that never satisfies. These patterns don't feel like chains, they feel like choices, like just how you are. That's what makes them so effective. You can be politically free and inwardly enslaved. The Greek word for know here, ginosko, is experiential, not knowledge from reading, knowledge from living through something. The difference between knowing intellectually that grief is painful and knowing it because you sat next to a grave. When you actually see something true about yourself without flinching, something shifts, not immediately, not dramatically, but something quietly begins to come loose. That is the freedom he was describing, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances, the kind that comes from the inside out. So let's sit with what just happened. We started with 6 teachings, 6 phrases so familiar they've almost lost their edges. And underneath each one, we found something sharper, stranger, and more alive than the version most of us were given. The kingdom of heaven isn't a place you wait for. It's a quality of life you can inhabit right now in the middle of ordinary existence. Loving your enemy isn't about feeling something you can't feel. It's about refusing to let hatred do to you what it did to them. Turning the other cheek isn't surrender. It's the bravest, most subversive act of defiance available to someone with no conventional power. Not judging isn't moral relativism. It's the humbling recognition that the log in your own eye will always distort your view of everyone else's speck. Being poor in spirit isn't weakness. It's the radical, terrifying openness that only comes to people who have been emptied of their pretense and live to tell about it. The truth that sets you free isn't a belief system. It's an experience, an unflinching encounter with what is actually real about yourself that slowly loosens the chains you didn't know you were wearing. What emerges when you look at all of this together is not a religion, not a rule book, not a reward system. It's a vision of what a human life could be, coherent, demanding, and surprisingly tender, aimed not at the powerful, not at the comfortable, but at the people on the hillside who were exhausted and broken and wondering if any of it meant anything. He wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear. He was telling them what almost no one else would say, that the very things they were ashamed of, their emptiness, their powerlessness, their uncertainty, might be exactly what qualified them for something real. 2,000 years later, billions of people, endless argument, and that message still hasn't found everyone it was meant for. Maybe it found you today. If something here reframed even one phrase for you, share it, not to convince anyone. Just because this message deserves to travel further than an algorithm allows. Subscribe. Comment if something moved you. See you in the next one.